The Atlantic slave trade was a vast and highly organized system that operated for over 300 years, fundamentally reshaping societies across Africa, Europe, and the Americas. It was not just a series of isolated events, but a global network of trade, power, and exploitation. European merchants, African intermediaries, and American plantation owners were all connected in a system designed to extract labor and generate profit. At its core was the forced removal of millions of Africans from their homelands, often through violence, kidnapping, or warfare. In many cases, local conflicts in West and Central Africa were intensified by European demand for enslaved people, as rival groups captured and sold prisoners. Coastal trading posts, sometimes called slave forts, became holding centers where captured individuals were imprisoned in cramped, dark conditions while awaiting transport. These forts, such as those along the coast of present-day Ghana, were places of fear and uncertainty, where families were permanently separated before the ocean crossing even began. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was one of the most horrific aspects of the entire system. Slave ships were designed to carry as many people as possible, maximizing profit at the expense of human life. Men, women, and children were typically separated and shackled in rows below deck. The lack of ventilation, combined with heat and overcrowding, created suffocating conditions. Many ships had platforms built to stack people in layers, reducing space even further. Food was minimal and often of poor quality, and access to clean water was limited. Disease spread rapidly, and the smell of sickness and death filled the ships. Crew members used violence to maintain control, and punishments were severe. Women and girls were especially vulnerable to sexual abuse by crew members. Although these ships were tightly controlled, resistance still occurred. Some captives organized uprisings, attempting to take over ships despite the risks. Others resisted in quieter ways, holding on to cultural practices, songs, or spiritual beliefs as a form of psychological survival. Upon arrival in the Americas, enslaved Africans entered a new phase of hardship. They were treated as property and sold in public auctions, where buyers inspected them and bid based on physical strength, age, and perceived usefulness. Families were often torn apart permanently during these sales. The majority were sent to plantations, particularly in the Caribbean and Brazil, where sugar production was extremely labor-intensive and deadly. Sugar plantations had some of the harshest conditions in the entire system, with high mortality rates due to overwork, injury, and disease. In North America, enslaved people were more commonly used for tobacco and cotton kati, especially as cotton production expanded in the 19th century. Others worked in mines or in urban settings as domestic servants, craftsmen, or laborers. Regardless of location, enslaved people had little to no control over their lives. Laws known as slave codes restricted movement, prohibited education, and enforced strict punishment for any form of resistance. Despite these oppressive conditions, enslaved Africans and their descendants built resilient communities and preserved elements of their heritage. Cultural traditions blended African, European, and indigenous influences, creating new identities across the Americas. Music, for example, became a powerful form of expression and resistance, eventually influencing genres such as spirituals, blues, and later jazz. Religious practices also adapted, combining African beliefs with Christianity in unique ways. Language, food, and storytelling all carried traces of African origins, demonstrating the strength and endurance of enslaved communities. Resistance to slavery was constant and took many forms, from subtle acts of defiance to large-scale revolts.
Everyday resistance included slowing down work, feigning illness, breaking tools, or secretly learning to read and write. Escape was another powerful form of resistance, with some individuals fleeing to remote areas and forming independent settlements known as maroon communities. These communities existed in places like Jamaica, Brazil, and Suriname, and some were able to survive for generations. Larger rebellions, although risky, had significant impacts. The most notable was the Haitian Revolution, which began in the French colony of Saint-Domingue. Enslaved people organized a massive uprising, defeating French, Spanish, and British forces over more than a decade of conflict. The revolution ended with the establishment of Haiti as an independent nation in 1804, marking the first successful slave revolt in history. This event shocked slave-holding societies and inspired both fear and hope across the Americas. European powers were deeply invested in maintaining the slave trade because of the enormous profits it generated. Nations such as Portugal, Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands competed for control over territories and trade routes. Plantation economies depended on enslaved labor to produce goods that were in high demand in Europe. Sugar, in particular, became one of the most profitable commodities, leading to the expansion of plantations and an increased demand for enslaved workers. This economic dependence made it difficult to end the system, even as moral opposition to slavery grew. The movement to abolish the slave trade gained strength in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Activists, including formerly enslaved individuals, writers, and religious groups, worked to expose the brutality of slavery. In Britain, William Wilberforce was a leading political figure in the campaign to end the trade. Public awareness grew through books, speeches, and organized campaigns, leading to increased pressure on governments. Britain passed a law in 1807 banning the slave trade, and the United States followed in 1808. However, illegal trading continued for years, and slavery itself remained legal in many places. The final abolition of slavery came later and varied by region. The British Empire abolished slavery in 1833, while the United States did so in 1865 after a civil war. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery in 1888. The legacy of the Atlantic slave trade is profound and continues to shape the modern world. It created large populations of people of African descent throughout the Americas, forming what is known as the African diaspora. Economically, it helped build the wealth of European nations while leaving lasting inequalities in formerly colonized regions. Socially, it reinforced racial hierarchies that have long-term consequences, contributing to systemic racism and discrimination that persist today. At the same time, the cultural contributions of African peoples have had a lasting and positive